Today I'm showing how to remove fuel injectors on Saab 9.3 2.0T B207 petrol engine. This video is in response to a request on one of the Saab Facebook groups. It turns out there aren't many videos showing this, and one that does is 40 minutes long. I can get the injectors out and back in quicker than that. Let's get right to it. First of all, you'll need a T30 Torx. Remove the 3 screws that hold in the front engine cover and the 4 screws that hold in the cover over the coils, and remove those 2 covers. Make sure that the ignition is off and the key is out of the ignition switch. Put a small container or a rag just underneath the fuel supply pipe, take off the cover and press the valve to release any fuel pressure. Now remove the electrical connections from the aircon high pressure switch, the engine temperature sensor, the boost valve and the throttle body. You'll need to remove the connections to the engine ECU, but to help remove those connections without breaking anything, apply some light lubricant to the slider mechanism holes on both sides, as in this picture here. Press the button at the front there and then pull back on this lever, which you might find easier to do with a small screwdriver, about a 5mm one. At the same time, push those 2 legs backwards. Make sure that the slider is pulled all the way back, and then the connector should come away easily. If you don't lubricate this, you can end up breaking all of that, something that I've done in the past. With a 10mm socket, release this earth strap from the ECU and pull the vacuum pipe off the fuel pressure regulator. With a 24mm spanner and a 22mm spanner, undo the unions bringing the fuel pipes to the fuel rail and pull the pipes out and just move them over to one side. With your 10mm socket, undo the 3 nuts that hold the harness into place. Be careful not to lose them down into the engine. Magnetic pickup is very useful. Top tip, you can even use your magnetic pickup as somewhere to keep the nuts safe. And lift the harness away from above the fuel rail. You can get a bit more slack if you feel you need it by disconnecting the coils, but make sure that you'll be able to know which connector goes to which coil when you put it all back. Now you'll need a deep 10mm socket to undo the 2 screws that are holding the fuel rail down. Good idea at this stage to spray a little light lube down into the holes where the injectors go. It'll make it a little easier to pull the injectors out. And waggle the fuel rail and pull it up and forwards at about 45 degrees. Press the little tag on the connector and disconnect the connector from the injectors. Do that for all 4. They're a little awkward to get at, so you might need a pair of fine nose pliers. Then with a little bit of jiggery pokery, you'll be able to get the fuel rail complete with injectors out. I found it easier to pull it out of the side. To get the injectors off the rail, pull the clips off, and then same technique, waggle and pull out of the cups. Make sure that the O-ring comes with it. Same goes at the other end as well, from the head. A problem I encountered when taking these injectors out, this brown plastic ring here, which retains the lower O-ring into place, on one of the injectors, it broke in half, and so it left the O-ring behind in its hole in the head, and the O-ring and the broken parts fell into the intake runner of the cylinder head. As a result, I had to take the inlet manifold off in order to be able to get into the inlet runner to retrieve those parts. Now this car's 13 years old, has done 150,000 miles. Obviously though, that plastic rings had deteriorated over that time, and if you remove the inlet manifold you can stuff some cloth into the ports so that they can catch anything that falls in. And since I had the inlet manifold off anyway, so I'm leaving the throttle body and the engine ECU off while I put the injectors back, just to give myself a bit more room. Sorry I wasn't able to record the removal of the inlet manifold. I'm pressed for time on this job. The car's got to go to Malcolm Miles in Leicester for a new clutch. But if manifold removal is something you'd like a video on, put it in the comments, let me know, and I can always do it again. A couple of precautions though, whilst putting the injectors back. It is all pretty much the reverse of taking it apart, except that put a little petroleum jelly on the O-rings at both ends before putting them in. Just a smear. Never put O-rings into place completely dry. You run the risk of damaging them. Pre-assemble your injectors to the fuel rail. Push the injector into place. and then put the clip on from the side where the tag is. The clip will orient the injector so that the connector points forward and ever so slightly towards the right side of the car. The eagle-eyed amongst you may well have spotted this one-piece silicone top radiator hose, which replaces the need to have one of those feeble plastic T-pieces. If you fancy one of these for your B207, I'll put the link down in the description. Once you've positioned the fuel rail and the injectors, sit them gently into the holes. Don't push them into place yet, because whilst you can still move it about is the time to connect up the harness to the injectors. Otherwise it becomes very fiddly. The connectors will only go on one way. Make sure that the connectors click firmly home and that you can't pull them back off, because if they're not, then engine vibration could cause them to come loose and come off, and then of course you've got a misfire situation. Position the rail and the injectors so that they're all square to their holes. Push them into place. They might need a little wiggling. Make sure that they are pushed home and that the O-ring has gone into its hole. Then put the two screws into place that hold the fuel rail into position. Nip them down gently, a little bit at each end, and that will help to push the injectors into their holes in the head. Just make sure that everything's in place. Don't forget, of course, to reconnect the pipe for the fuel pressure regulator. Before you put the fuel pipes back on, give the ends a clean with a bit of clean rag and some carburettor cleaner. There is an O-ring in there that seals on this pipe, so you don't have to tighten these nuts down tremendously tight. Just nip them down hand tight. The O-ring provides the seal. Here's a top tip. When you're putting nuts back onto a stud and they're in a recess that you can't get your fingers into, use your magnetic pickup tool. Put the nut in the centre of the tool, use the tool, turn the nut 2 or 3 times, just enough so that it's on the thread, and then you can come in with your socket and you don't run the risk of losing the nut somewhere down in the depth of the engine. Carry on putting it together the way you got it apart, and all the electrical bits and pieces that you disconnected. Easily forgotten air conditioning connector down here, a bit sort of out of sight, out of mind.